Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about mental health in the city. So my name is Angela Blocker, and I'm an LMFT, and those are fancy letters that just mean marriage and family therapist, which means that I take a relational and systemic approach to counseling, understanding that a person is more than the sum of their parts, basically. So understanding that people are in relationships, and broken relationships have a big impact on our mental health. So I'm going to ask for some flexibility with this presentation. So mental health is a very sensitive subject, and so I think that it's important for us to be a little bit more flexible with the things that we hear today. And this presentation actually has two parts. The first part is just talking about mental health in America, and then mental health in Houston and in Harris County specifically. So there are unique challenges to mental health just in where we are. And the second part just talks about our role as believers, as Christ followers. How do we give a gospel-centered approach to mental illness? So more than half of the global population currently lives in cities, with an increasing number moving towards urbanization. So people are moving towards cities, and living in cities has a different effect on mental health than does living in rural America or rural populations. So what you're looking at right now is people who are declaring the mental illnesses that they have. And so this was actually a project that was done to just demonstrate how different mental illness can look. A lot of times we can get a picture of what we think mental illness ought to look like. And I think we more often than not picture the tents that are back there in the bottom. Because homelessness has a high level of mental illness, as Pastor Jonathan talked about last week. We know that there is there's high prevalence for mental illness with people who are homeless. So these other pictures represent other people who might be living in the city who also suffer, and they look no different from you and I, because we know that mental illness isn't just something that is outside of like cities or outside of rural areas or outside of the church even. So this is called the Dior Vargas Project. So she basically wanted to change how mental illness is represented, and so that's why these faces are before you, because it's the reality of so many people in our community. So what are some influences on living in the city, and how does that affect our mental health? So in the city, we see increases in mood and anxiety disorders. So mood disorders, those who live in cities have an increased mood disorders are higher by 39%, anxiety by 21%. We see double the risk of schizophrenia in cities, up by like 2.3 times the regular population of those outside of cities. Now, it's important to take these statistics with a grain of salt, of course, because like we were talking about earlier, like homelessness has a higher level of mental illness, and you visibly see more homeless people in cities than you would in a rural community. And so part of the reason why schizophrenia may be so high is because of just how visible they are. And so that's something to take into consideration. Within the city, we see decreases in suicide risk, and that's almost by half. We see decreases in dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and decreases in substance abuse disorders. So alcoholism, marijuana usage, and other drug abuses are decreased in cities. And so why is this? Why is there an increase in some areas, and why is there a decrease in some areas? And so researchers boiled it down to basically three things. The first thing is pre-existing risk factors. So many people move to the city in search of better services, like better social and economic opportunities, right? And so, and also a lot of times they want distance from past experiences. So the reasons why people might seek out cities might be, those reasons might be the things that sort of give them the pre-existing condition towards mental illness. So, for example, if you're coming from poverty has high transience. People are moving around a lot, right? There's a lack of stability that's there. So that increases the chances for mental illness in a lot of ways. It is a significant factor. The same is true for people who are unemployed, right? Even if they were living in a rural community and they've been working there for like 30 years, they lose their job, they now have to move to the city, start all over, and losing your job is just hard enough. And so that's another thing that sort of sets a pre-existing condition. We talked about homelessness a little bit last week. And so that's something else. Along with family breakups, divorces, people move after these sorts of things. And so that you're dealing with the stress of a broken relationship, and then you're moving to a new place at the same time. Just the sheer amount of stress puts you in a situation where there can be a higher likelihood of symptomology. So these are just some pre-existing risk factors that influence why cities have a higher level of anxiety and things like that. I also want to talk about immigration because we're in Houston, and that's something that's sort of something that's kind of unique to Houston with all of the diversity. And so when you're moving from one place, regardless of whether you're in a immigration, like you're immigrating for safety purposes, if you're immigrating to just provide a better opportunity for your family, you're dealing with like language barriers, you're dealing with a whole new culture, and just picking yourself up and moving yourself to a whole new culture has a different level of stress. And usually when people are picked up and moved from one place to another, if they're coming from another cultural background, they're placed in cities. And so when we talk about cities in the weeks to come, specific cities, you'll see how things like social factors really come into play with immigrants, right? So they're coming from, if we think about like Irish Catholics and Germans, right, in New York, like in the early 1800s, like 1900s, we can see how social factors like discrimination plays a role on your mental health as well. So there's so many different things that can influence cities having a higher population of mental illness. And so I just started with social factors, but the social aspects of a city can be broken down into several different parts. So we know that cities, in Houston, we don't have like zoning or anything like that. And so in other cities where there is zoning, you might have to deal with discrimination, racism, and that's something that comes into play. That's just another sort of layer to deal with when you are living in a city that can affect your mental health. Environmental factors. So because you're living in a city, there are two ways that the environment plays a role on your health. So the first one is that we have increased stimuli in cities. So the sights, the smells, the sounds, like all of those, they play a huge role. There's also a higher density in cities, so people are living closer together, and because they're living closer together, you hear more things, and it's louder. There's less space to move around, and it affects you. And so this can lead to overload, and overload. When people are overloaded, you want to just find a quiet space. And that's something that's not as easy in the city as in the country, right? In the country, there's lots of like green, there's lots of open spaces, but in the city, you have to go to like a park. And if your city doesn't have like a park, then it's kind of difficult, right? So people living in New York City, right, they have Central Park, and I don't know if you've been to Central Park, but it's not a quiet place. So because cities don't have as many of these things, these are kind of protective factors, things like having like open space, having more leisure time. These are things that you don't always consider consider as impacts on mental health when you're living in a city. So people are overloaded and their protective factors are gone. So protective factors are things that sort of help help reduce symptoms of like mental illness. So this is things like taking time off. These are things like having a supportive network of family and friends, having open spaces to relax in, things like that. But when you're in a city, right, people are working a lot more. There is less leisure time, and because there's less leisure time, people have less time to sort of kind of take a break. And I don't know about you, but if I'm going to take a vacation, I'm probably not going to go to like a city. I'm going to go to like a relaxing place, like Florida, which is a little bit like, it's warmer, there's a beach, right? There's like, I mean, you still have to deal with a bunch of people, but it's not in the same capacity. So because you have less of those protective factors, there's a higher likelihood for mental illnesses to occur, or even just mental distress. So where is Houston in all of this? So adults in America suffering with mental illness is about 61.5 million. And you can see so serious mental illness, these are things like pervasive mental illnesses that seriously disrupt a person's ability to function and take care of themselves. So there is a difference between serious mental illness and mental distress, which I didn't really put in here. But I want you to just take a look at adults in Harris County. Okay, so the population of Harris County is about 4.5 million. And so you figure that 1.1 million suffers from some form of mental illness. And this could be like anxiety, depression. Like 1 in 4 people basically is suffering from like schizophrenia or something like that. But that's 1 in 4. So if I ask like, I'm not sure if there are people in here who got a string. Did anyone get a string in here? Okay, if you have a string, could you please stand up? I'm not going to ask you to do anything, don't worry. Okay. Okay, so in this room, congratulations, guys. I'm just kidding. So 1 out of 4 people. So in this room, this is how many people statistically, and I use that with an asterisk, could be suffering with a mental illness, right? So this is a huge population. You guys can go ahead and have a seat. Thank you, guys. And so in the state of Texas, spends less than a third than the U.S. average on mental health services. So they spend about $39 a person. And Louisiana spends about $62 a person. Alabama is $78, and Mississippi is $115. So this is like Mississippi is $115 and Texas is $39. So you can see that there's a huge need for support for this population. This leads us to the second part, which is what's our role, right? What do we do with this? I love Luke 4. This is after Jesus has just healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law, and everybody is like, oh my goodness, Jesus can heal, let's bring like a bunch of people. And Jesus heals people with with all kinds of diseases, right? It doesn't say all of the ones that he healed, they're not listed, but we know that he healed like a lot of people. And I think it's clear like that we as God's people are to care for those who are suffering with mental illness. So I kind of have a like a sort of life verse that I use when I practice, and that's 2 Corinthians 2, 2 through 7. And so that is, grace to you and peace from God and our Father, the Lord Jesus Christ. Praise to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, and the God of all comfort. He comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any kind of affliction through the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For as the sufferings of Christ overflow to us, so through Christ our comfort also overflows. If we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which is experienced in your endurance of the same sufferings that we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that you share in the sufferings, so you also will share in our comfort. So I don't want to get into all of this, but basically by referring to God as the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, Paul is making a statement about God's connection to those who are hurting, right? There's a clear link there. And so while books, counseling, and even medicine may offer some degree of help, we know that God is the ultimate source of healing, and that's of hope and of help. So that's something that we can't forget. And so that's not to say that anyone struggling with mental illness needs to trust God and pray more, but the roots and causes of mental illness can be varied and diverse, and God does work through medicine and counseling and things like that, but all of that starts and ends with Him. So we need to remember that God is our source of help and comfort in times of trouble. So with that being said, that speaks to we as believers, those in the body of faith and those outside of the body. That's sort of like a frame of, that's sort of like a mindset to hold. So just some information. I'm going to talk about some considerations moving forward. So families in which a child or parent is being treated with mental illness are significantly less likely to attend worship services or small groups. And that's a huge number. If we're talking about like potentially a fourth of Harris County choosing not to be involved in any sort of church activity or any sort of small group because of their mental illness. There's 100 other reasons, but that's quite a huge number. And so these families represent an enormous mission field for us, and they're just living right in the shadows of our church. And so I think a first step is to identify and understand the obstacles to their participation in worship, and then move on from there. So of course the biggest obstacle is healing relationships, right? So this is our starting point. I have a picture here that just shows of course after the fall, we are completely separated from God, from ourselves, from others, and from the rest of creation. And that influences, it's kind of small print, but it influences political systems, religious systems, social systems, like everything is kind of ruined because of the fall. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, is that we first and foremost have the ministry of reconciliation, which is forming these relationships so that they can see Christ in us, and remembering speaking the gospel in our own lives as we go out. And the brain is the most complex organ in our body, and it's liable to be the most affected of all of our organs by the fall and the divine curse on our bodies. And that's not something that we think about when we think about how all of every part of ourselves is fallen. And that's from David Murray's And Christians Get Depressed Too. So we as Christ followers, obviously we don't exist in a bubble, so it's very important for us to know that we are we're not supposed to be isolated, and we look to God as our source of comfort. And as we are comforted, we anticipate and look forward to sharing his comfort with others. So first consideration is just healing relationships. And then these. So reasons why people don't want to be around people who say that they are followers of Christ or any church activities is stigma. Even though we live in a more modern or postmodern society, there's still a huge stigma around mental illness and talking about it. Even saying words like anxiety and depression are not words that are easily received. Anxiety, this is something to consider too. How might a new social interaction influence somebody who has social anxiety coming to church? Like we talk about all the time how we need to be like super welcoming to everyone, but that can get kind of overwhelming to somebody who has like high anxiety, right? And that's just something to think about and to be mindful of. Expectations for self-discipline. So the Bible is clear about how self-control is equated with self-discipline, or self-control is with spiritual maturity. And being gracious with people, because people with mental illness, a lot of times it's their executive functioning doesn't work as well as it can, right? And so being patient with them as they have trouble establishing priorities or planning for the future or managing time or delaying gratification. Sensory processing. People with autism or sensory processing disorder, right? Things like lights and flashes. These are all things that can be deterrents to people if you're inviting them in. And so thinking about like even the music, right? Like how loud is it when people are coming in? Is it better to maybe say, hey, thank you so much for coming. Let's why don't we meet in this room over here so it's not as loud? Things like this. Expectations for hugs. Now I'm a huge hugger, and so at the same time, knowing that might make someone feel really uncomfortable, and we talk about this from a cultural lens, but also from the lens of mental health. That's something to consider. Also with strong perfume or cologne, right? People have allergies, but also that heightened sensation might be overstimulating to a person. Social communication. This is basically things like language, facial expression, eye contact, vocal tone. It can very easily be misinterpreted by a person with mental illness, and so really turning a sensitive ear to how you think things are being perceived, and not jumping to conclusions about how a person is taking this, but slowing yourself down to really ask a lot of questions. Like, I noticed that your face changed when I said this. Do you have a question about something? How did you interpret the way that I just said this or reacted? Inflection of voice is a huge one as well. So I interned for 3 years, and I had one client, and I said something, like when I get really excited, my voice goes up, and it kind of triggered my client, and she just reverted back to some things that she went back to before, and she asked me if I was somebody that I wasn't, but she just the inflection of your voice can have a huge impact on people. So just to consider that as well. Social isolation, this talks about kind of what I talked about before. Being in social settings is something that's very difficult for people with mental illness, and so put that on top of being inside a city where more people are isolated. People are more isolated in cities than they are in urban or rural or suburban communities. So just know that getting someone out to have coffee with you can be a big challenge. And so really taking time to say things like, you know what, thank you so much for joining me. I know that that's not the easiest thing to do, or so I just appreciate you taking time out of your schedule or out of your alone time to do that. also with social communication, so because people with like depression or anxiety frequently can withdraw from social activities, or they can just understand that sometimes they can be overwhelmed by them. Another important thing is communicating to your children about how to speak with people with mental illness, because kids, they are the most honest people, and they point out differences. Like they know it, and sort of using those as teaching opportunities to say, like, you know, we don't laugh at this. This is what's going on. I know it seemed funny, but this is something that the person maybe can't control, and to really foster a sense of empathy and compassion with them. Okay, and so social communication, social isolation are two things, but I think the biggest one is past church experiences. So reasons why people don't want to, like sometimes they hear the word Christian or disciple or follower of Christ, and they're just like, because of my experiences, I don't want to step foot in a church. I don't want to step foot in a small group. I don't want to go to. Sometimes I don't even want to have coffee with you, and a lot of times that can be for a lot of different reasons. But if they have a family member who went to a church with someone who was mentally ill, and the church did not receive them well, because up until recently, most churches, they don't even have a policy for how to deal with someone who's mentally ill, and there's a lot of confusion and ignorance around the subject. And so really being gracious with people, knowing that they may have had really damaging experiences with a family member around going to church, because there wasn't anything for them. So when I was a freshman in college, I had there's a group called Friends, Jesus' Friends and Me, and basically it was a group for people who had severe cystic fibrosis, severe epilepsy, and so it was like a worship service that was just for them. And so like the music was set a certain way, and like worship was done very, very differently, but it still provided a space. And so unless there's an education and there's a know-how to do something like that, there can be a lot of stigma and a lot of shame put on people whose family members have mental illnesses. If it's like a parent, when they have children who grow up, oh, well, you know, my mom was kind of ostracized because she had this, like severe depression or bipolar or schizophrenia or something like that. So I don't know about those Christians, or I don't know about this. I don't know about this Jesus person, because how could they allow something like that to happen? So even the children of people with mental illnesses are affected. So these are all different things to think about when someone mentions like mental illness, whether or not it's severe or not. So I just want to say one more thing. So going back to our role, I do want to say that because most of us it can be very uncomfortable talking about things like this, and it's so hard to know like what to say or what to do or how to respond. We can be confident in knowing that the knowledge of God calls us to serve all people, and it's regardless of mental disability, physical disability, or anything like that, so that we can feel confident that we know the Lord, and He's called us to love. I had the verse from John up here earlier, that we're called to love others as Christ has loved us. So, any questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you knew anything about the difference between, say, schizophrenia and demon possession, because it sounds like a joke question, but a lot of people have had trouble historically differentiating the two, and then identifying the two, because there's a lot of similarities in the symptoms.
Let me say it this way. Like, I do know that you're right. That is an even mental illness with demon possession in general can be a thing. I think that it comes from a lack of understanding of schizophrenia, because there can be Christians who have schizophrenia who are not demon possessed, and it's basically just a list of symptoms that fit with a disorder. There are also people who can be, I think, can be demon possessed who don't have schizophrenia, and so. My background is marriage and family, so I don't deal with a lot of schizophrenia, but what I can say is that there is like the delusions, the hallucinations, like those things, a lot of those can be sort of regulated with medication, whereas demon possession is something that it doesn't matter how much you medicate it, like that's not something that's going to go away. So I do think that there is a lot of confusion, and I do know that psychology is a very young field and that we'll never completely know for sure, but that we can trust that we still have, like as Christians, we still have a responsibility towards, whether they're schizophrenic or not, like to love others.
So in Matthew 8, there's a man who's demon possessed. He cuts himself, he cries all day, right? Yeah. In modern psychology, they would label that guy as probably schizophrenic, but we know from the scriptures that he's demon possessed, so I just wondered what the differentiation was.
Yeah, I think it varies. Like schizophrenia is huge, and so is demon possession. Like, I don't think that it's fair to say, because the trouble is you've got to think about what Jesus was trying to do there, right? He was reconciling a man completely, and I do think that's a beautiful example of how restorative Jesus, like how Jesus heals. But I think the trouble is if we say like, okay, in Scripture we see this man was doing this must mean that this is schizophrenia, or this must mean that this is demon possession. Because I guarantee you there are more people who are demon possessed in the Bible who didn't do those things. And that there are people who, obviously were. I do think there was clearly an element of mental healing there, but I think we have to be careful with saying that this was definitely this or this was definitely not this. Okay, so I know it's kind of a tricky question, but I hope that sort of says that this is all going from the DSM, which changes so often. I think. And as a marriage and family therapist, we don't really deal with diagnosis very much just because we take a more relational approach. But I will say that I think it's important to recognize that the point of that passage was more talking about Jesus's ability to heal, and he was talking there was a restorative capacity there. That the point is that Jesus is someone who can his healing isn't something that's limited. So, I'm not sure I answered your question.
No.
Yes.
I think it's hard to differentiate the medical aspect of things and the spiritual part. Just in personal experience with our family, when my husband had experienced severe depression, I know comments that I received, and I was new to it. I had never experienced anyone around me having a mental illness. And I remember questions just from, I think, well-meaning people. And, well, do you think he really has Jesus in his heart? Maybe he has sin in his life. Or maybe he is demon possessed. Because of, he would say he'd hear voices, but it was a paranoid state. And so I think that the medical, I think it's hard to, I think for us as believers, maybe not everybody, but I would say our personal experience was marrying the two. It was hard to conceive someone who is a believer struggling that much mentally. So physiological differences, spiritual different. I think we can't just I think what you're saying is I understand what you're trying to say, because you can't just make a blanket statement and say they're demon possessed or they're not.
Yeah.
I mean, it's truly a fine line.
It is a
I think
fine
what
line.
we have to do too is remember that the brain is an organ. The brain is an organ. It requires blood flow. It requires, electricity with the neurons and everything. It is an organ, and mental health takes place in the brain. So mental health, we think of it, it's something that's in your thoughts. It is a physiological condition. So mental health is physiological health. So when we're thinking of mental health, it's not just, we're not just talking about people's thoughts and feelings. We're talking about their brain, which is an organ, which is treatable. And so when Jesus was healing, the man with the demon possession, there was another incident in Luke where Jesus healed the woman with the crooked back, and he touched her and she straightened up. And then the synagogue leader told the woman, there's 6 days to come get healed. Why do you have to come on the Sabbath? And Jesus said, how can you, this is a daughter of Abraham that Satan has bound for 18 years. So this is a physical, her back was bent over for 18 years. And Jesus was attributing that to Satan. So it doesn't mean that she was a sinner, that's why her back was bent over. But I think it was just Jesus acknowledging that, all sickness and disease, is a result of the fall, and it goes back to Satan. And so, and I know it's easy, people like to twist, mental illness with demon activity and stuff. And yeah, it may be originally all illness we can attribute back to that. But I don't think we should be very careful not to be in that group that stigmatizes people because of mental illness, saying, oh, well, that's a sin problem, or that's, yeah, we all have a sin problem, okay? So we can't just draw, our fingers on that. I do have a question though. I have several family members and friends I know that have generalized anxiety disorder, along with maybe other diagnoses. But as far as the church, our welcome time, where we're hugging or shaking hands, I know people that won't come to church because of that, or they will wait till they know when we're done with that before they will walk in, because that does cause them great anxiety. Would you have a suggestion how we can handle that differently as a church to make everyone feel welcome without necessarily going in for the hug? I mean, I'm a hugger too, and I also realize that not everybody is. And a lot of people are germaphobes for whatever reason, and they don't even like the handshake.
Yeah.
I think, is there a better way we can?
I think just asking the question, and this will be the last question, but I think just asking the question, saying hey, is it okay if I give you a hug? Before you come in, just really being sensitive, okay, this is somebody, and just being taking an observational stance, okay, this is someone who came in after all of this has happened, and really talking to them about, just having a conversation with them, because I do think that the majority of that, the majority of people who do have difficulty with that, and they may know themselves well enough to say, hey, this is something that I'm not comfortable with. And if they don't, they'll let you know it, but it might not be with words, but you'll, and then using that experience the next time to say, hey, you know what, I noticed this happened last time. Do you mind if I sit with you until after all of this, and then we can go in together, or something like that. But I think just having a raised awareness of these are things that do affect people differently is important. So, thank you, Janet.